Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give people another minute or so to log on and join us. And to start, while we're waiting, if everyone could maybe just chat in to share where they're joining from today, that would be really nice to learn. I'm based in New York City, and it's a really beautiful day, spring day here. And yeah, we'll get going in just another moment. All right, it's now 2 o'clock, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. My name is Ashley Lulling. I'm the Participant Experience Manager for InterExchange's outbound programs for U.S. citizens, and I also manage our Christensen Fellowship. And we're really excited to host this discussion today on ethical volunteering abroad with two of our Christensen Fellows, Neha Shah and Shivani Raman. And just to give a little background on InterExchange for those who are not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization based in New York City, and our mission is to promote cross-cultural understanding through experiential volunteer and work abroad programs inside the US and abroad. And we've been dedicated to this endeavor since 1968. Our Christensen Fellowship supports young US citizens who are passionate about contributing to and engaging with a community abroad and who are eager to learn about local culture as well as share American culture. Our fellows arrange a volunteer service project abroad for at least 6 months, and they've worked on a variety of multinational issues, including public health, environmental conservation, and female empowerment, among other topics. And the Fellowship Award supports fellows' living expenses while they're abroad. Given the rise in short-term volunteer programs and the increasing popularity of taking a gap year, which often entails a volunteer abroad component, we really wanted to have this discussion. We think it's really important that we're thinking critically about the ways in which volunteer program providers are engaging volunteers in conversations about the communities in which they're volunteering, and for volunteers to really think critically about their role and their impact on host communities. This is essential no matter the length of volunteer service to ensure that host communities are not harmed and that the service is positively productive for both the host and the volunteer. Our discussion today is going to focus on volunteering abroad outside of the US, but many of the things we'll discuss are applicable to volunteering within the US and volunteering in general. Here's our agenda. We'll start with a brief overview of the increasing trend in short-term volunteer programs, including taking a gap, as well as taking a gap year. And this will be followed with an overview of some of the potential pitfalls with volunteering abroad. Next, I'm going to introduce the concept learning service, which is an ethical approach to volunteering abroad that InterExchange supports. Then we'll have a discussion with our Christensen Fellows, which will be structured around the tenets of this learning service approach. And once we get to this discussion phase, we will turn on our cameras. Lastly, we will reserve time at the end for questions, so please feel free to chat any questions in the chat box. My colleague Stephanie will be monitoring that, and we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end of the discussion. We can trace the rise in short-term volunteer programs to around the 1980s. And in the 1990s, the term voluntourism emerged to describe a travel experience that includes volunteering along with more traditional tourist activities. Most people in the US have very little vacation time, so voluntourism is quite appealing. This is a $2 billion a year industry, and it's estimated that more than 1.6 million people are volunteering while on vacation every year. Taking a gap year has also become increasingly popular in the US, and this is typically a year-long break before, during, or after college, during which students and young people engage in various educational and developmental activities. Not all gap years entail volunteering abroad, but many do. And international service is also becoming part of many companies' corporate social responsibility policies. And the service-based travel market is largely unregulated. Volunteer travel is often marketed as a fun and seemingly simple answer to the question, how can I do good in the world? Which speaks to volunteers' desire to help or make a difference. But here are some of the potential pitfalls in terms of volunteering abroad. One is a failure to center the host community. Most volunteer programs implicitly or explicitly claim to address the problems of underdevelopment and promote some form of development. There's a lot of debate around the meaning of the term development and even more controversy about the best ways to promote it. A volunteer's perspective on what constitutes good development can be quite different than from the perspective of the local community. And if the volunteer project doesn't listen to the local community and center their needs, then it ends up being a self-serving project for volunteers. There's also the risk of the project being unsustainable. If the benefits of the volunteer project ends when the volunteer leaves, then the host community is at a loss. Also, projects without sound long-term plans risk being unsustainable. For example, building a school without a long-term plan to train and pay teachers and fund supplies renders that building useless. There's also a huge risk of inefficiency if volunteers don't have the necessary skills to make a contribution. Pippa Biddle was a volunteer from the West who went to an orphanage in Tanzania, and she and the other volunteers were tasked with building a library. However, they had no construction skills, and every night local men had to take down their structurally unsound building and rebuild it for them. And Pippa said this in a blog that went viral about her experience. It would have been more cost-effective, stimulative of the local economy, and efficient for the orphanage to take our money and hire locals to do the work. But there we were, trying to build straight walls without a level. There is also the risk to vulnerable children. Some of the most popular forms of volunteer travel involve working with children, usually in an informal caregiver role. And volunteers who want to help vulnerable children can potentially end up incentivizing harmful institutional care as the first option instead of a last resort. In some cases, orphanage owners have put pressure on disadvantaged parents to give up their children, with families split apart through deception, coercion, or even deliberate trafficking. And there's been a huge backlash against what's been termed as orphanage tourism because of this. And finally, we have the potential for the perpetuation of the white savior complex. Dr. Brittany A. Aronson writes that this mindset perpetuates the need for external forces to come in and save the day. But what gets left out of this conversation are the roles settler colonialism and white supremacy have had in creating these conditions in the first place. Often it's financially privileged Westerners who are volunteering abroad, many of whom are white, in what are often labeled as developing countries. And when we offer help, it automatically creates a relationship of giver and receiver. And this relationship can be imbued with the sense that the helpers, the volunteers, have some superiority over the host community. And problems arise when volunteers fail to recognize this power dynamic, especially when locals become relegated to one role, receiver. And this can lead to disempowering local leadership as well as reinforcing negative stereotypes and historical patterns of racism. Now, with that said, there is certainly value in volunteering abroad. It's a wonderful opportunity to build relationships and increase cross-cultural understanding, as well as to learn and share fresh perspectives, and as well sharing skills, which are empowering to the local community and to volunteers, and it's sustainable because that knowledge or training is enduring. So, with the potential pitfalls and the value in mind, as well as the knowledge that so many of our complex global issues require collaboration. Let's dive into the learning service approach to volunteering abroad. We have to learn before we can help is the essence of this approach, which was formulated by 4 individuals with extensive volunteer abroad experience. The 3 main tenets of the learning service approach are: number 1, learning pre-service, where the volunteer really takes the time to learn about themselves, the issue, the host community, as well as the organization they're considering volunteering with, all before they leave home. The second tenet is learning in service, which entails the volunteer looking to the local community for knowledge on how and when they might be able to add value and are open to learning from the local community. And finally, we have learning post-service, which entails the volunteer reflecting on the experience to inform their future action. And the tenets of the learning service approach will guide our discussion today with our Christensen fellows, Nea and Shivani, and we will follow up with resources after the webinar so that you can learn more about this approach. And so I would love to introduce our fellows, Shivani and Nea, who are so gracious to be with us today. If you both could turn on your cameras and your microphone, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And to start, can you both share just a little bit about your Christensen Fellowship? What exactly were you doing and what skills were you contributing? And Shivani, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to be able to share with you my experience as a Christensen Fellow. I was working with Partners in Health in Chiapas, Mexico last year, and specifically I was working as a community health worker supervisor. So essentially, in several rural communities, I was providing education and training to local community health workers, accompanying them on their visits with patients in the communities and providing feedback, and in general trying to support patients who had specific social needs as well.
Great, thank you. And Neha?
So I worked in 2017 as a fieldwork coordinator in part of the Eastern Cape in South Africa. So I worked on a public health research project that was jointly led by a university in the UK and a local South African university. And it was primarily taking a look at both indicators and barriers to adherence to antiretroviral treatment for HIV positive adolescents, as well as broadly some of the factors that influence utilization of sexual and reproductive health services there. And so my role was a mix of project and data management, so working with our local CLOSA research assistants to plan how to collect our data with adolescents in the area. So sometimes looking at like how we created survey questions, how we planned where we went and how effectively we could collect information. And then on the data side, making sure that our data was collected accurately, stored and cleaned securely, and doing some of the basic analysis with some of the principal investigators on the project.
Okay, great. Thank you both for providing that introduction for us. And so I want to start our conversation by kind of going more into this first tenet of the learning service approach, which is all about a volunteer taking the time to learn more about themselves and the issue and the host community, as well as the organization before going abroad. In terms of motivations, you know, if it's just a resume builder, then you might want to reevaluate volunteering abroad. Because if you're not going to be interested in the day-to-day tasks, then it's not really a valuable use of your time. You don't have to volunteer abroad to make a contribution. Sometimes advocating for policy change in your own country for policies that affect the host community can be more valuable. It's also really important at this stage that volunteers challenge their assumptions. Think about, you know, what do I know about the issue and the host community, and where did I get this information, and what are the potential limitations within those sources? And what's extremely critical at this stage is to evaluate your skill set. What skills are needed? What skills do I have? So we avoid the pitfall of inefficiency. A good rule of thumb, if you are not qualified to do it in your home country, ask, why would I be qualified to do it in someone else's? And it's also really important at this stage that volunteers think about or learn about the complexity and the nuance of the issue, as well as the historical and cultural context of the host community, so that you can get more of an understanding about the root causes of the issue. And finally, it's so important for volunteers to do their due diligence about the organization they're considering volunteering with. For example, is it respected in the host community? Are your values aligned? And where does the money go? So with this tenet in mind, I wanted to ask you both if you could please share how you prepared pre-service, specifically thinking about how you might have challenged your assumptions and learned about the nuances and the complexity of the issue, as well as the cultural context in your respective project locations. And Nea, why don't we start with you?
Sure. This is such an important piece, the pre-service learning. So I will say, firstly, it's challenging to gain some of this information in terms of like, how is an organization received in the local community that it's working in? I think remembering that there are power dynamics in existence in all of these organizations, sometimes it can be tough to get a really honest opinion about where an organization is succeeding, as well as like where it could do better. So I think that there are a couple pieces. The first is really like taking the time to prepare and yet keeping an open mind to the experiences you're going to have, and knowing that you can't possibly get all of the information before you begin. And then I think the other distinction I would share is like taking time to individually research. So exactly what you said, like taking time to learn about the local culture. So that can be language. I made sure to try to understand both like language and customs. So I studied some of Iskosa before moving there, so I could kind of at least engage with basic customs around making sure that you could greet and thank people before coming in and asking more, asking questions that might be more related to the direct communication style that we have in professional settings in the US and other Western countries. So understanding those differences and how to work in a multicultural professional setting. But also really taking some time to understand history and like remembering that people aren't always taught history in a fair or realistic way. So I think, at least in South Africa, understanding the legacy of colonialism and apartheid was quite important. And I don't claim to be an expert, but taking the time beforehand to do some research on that was really important. And then I would say outside of researching individually is connecting with others. So trying to cultivate a support network and communication pathways that are going to allow you to be effective throughout your service. So that's like building your individual self-care toolkit before you go so that you can recognize within yourself when you're not being as effective as you could. And I think for me, it was pretty important to connect with people who had worked on the project before. And just a couple of weeks before I left for South Africa, I connected with somebody by chance who gave me a pretty critical experience of the project, and it kind of shook me up, honestly. And I wondered, is this still something to participate in? How can I take this person's experience and be open to what will come through my own? But knowing sometimes it's tough to get the critical views of where a project can do better and where these service opportunities could be improved. So I think everyone who's joining a panel like this is making a really great stride in that. And I don't know that panels like this existed even like 5 years ago in the same depth when I was participating in my service. So I think connecting with groups like this who are willing to think about the ethics of international volunteering is a great place to start.
Great, thank you. And you made so many good points, like especially like trying to learn some of the local language is really important. If you are expecting to contribute and connect with the local community, you can't just dive right in terms of like, especially if it's something very personal like a health project. So really taking that time to learn and to be able to just have a conversation is really important. And then also the self-care aspect. I'm so glad you brought that up. I think that's a really important part because when you're abroad, it can be challenging, and when you add on to it, if you're working on an issue with a lot of complexity, it's really important that you have that self-care so that you can be as effective as possible. And also the point about trying to connect with somebody else who's already volunteered on the project. Certainly you have to know that that's just one perspective, but it is interesting to hear that, and you're right. I think, sometimes you don't always get the critical feedback perspective. So it's interesting that you had that and that you still had that open mind, Naya, to go, because you did get that beforehand. So thank you. And Shivani, yeah, I would love to hear, how did you prepare pre-service before you went to Mexico?
Sure. So I agree with everything Neha said. I think she brought up some really great points, and I definitely implemented a lot of the same strategies when I was preparing for my experience. But I think just building upon that, I would say that the preparation really extended several years before I actually went on this experience. So, for example, in college, I majored in sociology, and I studied a minor that's called Poverty, Justice, and Human Capabilities. And so I think those academic experiences really gave me a thorough foundation in concepts such as social inequity, global disparities, a participatory approach to community development, and how to achieve sustainable outcomes. So all of these really important concepts that I think are very good to know when you're going into this kind of experience, especially the participatory aspect of it, because I feel that I was actively trying to implement that as a volunteer. And I would say also the language component. So I spent several years prior to going on this really trying to become close to fluent in Spanish as possible, as well as taking some medical Spanish courses in college, so that I would be able to have the skills necessary to be effective in my role, as you mentioned, Ashley. And I think beyond that, also the organization itself also provided me with some valuable resources to prepare myself. So they actually put together a very detailed manual for my specific volunteer role, which every year was kind of edited by the most recent volunteers with some of the major barriers and challenges they faced and how to overcome those barriers, and tips that they had, things that worked for them. And so that was really helpful to read before I actually got to the communities. And then once I was there was a 2-week period of overlap where the previous volunteers actually provided kind of a debrief or a training period directly with me. And so, as Neha mentioned, just being able to talk to someone who had been in your role previously and hear from their direct experience was tremendously helpful in preparing me. So I think all of those things together were definitely helpful to prepare myself.
Great, thank you. And that's really nice that the organization provided those resources for you. To me, that's a sign that they care about their volunteers being effective and thoughtful. And then, yeah, like you said, Shivani, you took the time to study the language, and then you took coursework that would help prepare you. So anybody who's on here, if you currently are in school, you're thinking about enrolling in school, and you're interested in issue, look for those courses that can at least open you to the subject so you can learn. So that's both of you, that was really helpful. And then continuing with this tenet of learning pre-service, and this knowledge that there are power relations and power dynamics whenever you're going to help somebody. Did either of you consider the risk that your participation in your particular project could have potentially been perpetuating any type of colonial legacies, maybe potentially imposing any external values? And Neha, would you like to start?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, in short. Yes, I do think that I spent some time considering that, and also that there was that risk of perpetuating some harmful power dynamics and a legacy of colonialism. I think that there are a couple different pieces here. There's both acknowledging that those dynamics exist. There's making sure that you can engage in a way that doesn't further those legacies. And then there's actively working to dismantle existing inequities that are there. And I think that one thing that was critical for me that I'm not sure 5 years ago I fully had an understanding of was just recognizing where you yourself sit and where the organization you're working with sits in the spectrum of power and privilege. So I hold a lot of privilege in the US, I would say, as somebody who's like able-bodied, college educated, comfortably employed, native English speaking. And I think especially where I am now in the Bay Area, I would also say that, you know, in terms of gender and race, that I have a fair amount of privilege, or that I don't face like systemic oppression. But I think one thing I miscalibrated coming from like a pretty progressive school like UC Berkeley into this fellowship was really feeling like everybody had the ability to be vocal, and it's encouraged to engage in discourse around difficult topics. And I think just a combination of the interesting multicultural setting I was working in and just entering the workforce in general, you realize that like things can be political sometimes, and you can't always just point out certain ethical issues. So I think for me, there was a piece of like understanding how to both acknowledge that there were areas where our project could improve in its sustainability, and then separately thinking like, what are the things within my sphere of influence that I can actually impact? So, and how do you leverage your own kind of privilege, or where you sit in that spectrum in doing that, and redistributing some of the power that exists in the way that your project is engaging with the community. So I'm not sure if that totally answered the question, but I do think that I considered those things, but I think it's taken even years since to continue to ask myself what the best way to engage is, and how to give constructive feedback that that a project can really implement.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was really wonderful. And I think you touched on something so important is which, you know, at this stage is like taking stock of thinking about where you stand, your perspective, and all the ways you identify, and how that could be a privileged stance. You know, I think about the US passport is so powerful in so many other countries. It's not as easy to travel, and I sometimes forget that as a US citizen. So so thinking about the multiple ways you could potentially be privileged besides, I know I tend to always think about race, color, but there's so many different factors. And, you know, knowing just, I think having these questions in our mind is really important. We don't have all the answers, and just being open to learning is really important. And Shivani, I'd love to hear from you too about this. Did you consider, you know, the potential power dynamics before going?
Yes, that's definitely something I considered, and I think that I continued to think about throughout my experience. But luckily for me, I think the organization I was working with, Partners in Health, they did an incredible job, I think, really integrating discussions, open discussions about how to do this kind of health equity and social justice work in a way that does integrate community members directly and builds local capacity. And so essentially every single month we had a workshop where all of the volunteers, all of the staff members, and even sometimes local community members would all gather to engage in these kinds of discussions. And I thought that was an incredible initiative that really generated a lot of productive discussions, and that we were then able to implement in our individual roles when we went back to the communities. And I think in general, in all of the training that I received for my specific role, there was a big emphasis on, you know, be very open to directly integrating the perspectives, opinions, views of the community members into everything that you do, especially at first. And so I just felt that in general, there was a big emphasis placed on actively engaging community members in developing projects, changing projects over time, adjusting them, adapting them to how they would better be tailored to the needs of the community. And so I think that was something I worried about, but I think was well addressed in my case.
Yeah, it sounds like they really made an effort to center the host community so that they wouldn't be relegated to this receiver role, which is problematic, as we discussed. All right, great. So I want to move on to the second tenet of the learning service approach, which is all about continuing to learn. And it's about volunteers looking to the local community for knowledge on how and when they might be able to add value and continuing to be open to learning. And this is, at this stage, it's all about approaching the host community with cultural humility, which is this notion that you as the volunteer, you don't have all the answers, and you're open to learning as you go. You know your opinion might change. And acknowledging that the lived experiences of the individuals in the host community makes them the real experts. So I wanted to ask you both, like, how did you strive to approach your service with cultural humility? And how was this approach helpful to you? And Shivani, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think for me, the biggest thing was just spending the first few weeks, even the first couple of months, really just trying to practice open-mindedness and really just trying to learn everything that I could about the local context. So really taking time to develop those initial relationships with individuals in the organization, community members, the community health workers that I was directly working with, the staff in the local clinic, basically all of the different individuals who were relevant to the work that I was doing and a part of the context that I was working in, and just trying to understand as much as possible. And so one example of this is, I guess as this picture kind of shows, was when I was going into the homes to talk with the community health workers before jumping into kind of the technical aspects of my role, really taking the time to first develop the relationship, ask them how their day was going, how their week was going. You know, there were seasonal variations in terms of agricultural work, so learning about that, learning about their families, learning about the, you know, certain cultural traditions in the community that were prevalent. And so taking the time to really develop a thorough picture of the community was very important for me, and it was very important for developing trust and a communication that would facilitate my role as a volunteer. And so I would say that was the main thing that really facilitated kind of being successful in my role later on.
Great, thank you so much. And Naya, how about you? How did you strive to approach your service with cultural humility, and how did you find that was like a helpful in your service?
Yeah, I think Shivani touched on a lot of it. Generally, this idea of like the power of humble listening, especially early on, and remembering that a lot of us are pretty early in our career. Yes, I had a public health degree. Yes, I learned a lot about sexual and reproductive health, but knowing that I was not an expert in any of the lived experience or other cultural specific context that in the community that I was working in, and really remembering that expertise in things looks different, and my academic or theoretical knowledge of an issue is really, really helpful, but it is not, you really can't replace people's lived experience, and making sure that you prioritize the perspectives of your community, just as Shivani said. And I think, as she noted as well, just remembering that those first months are really a time to learn from others and see what's happening, and kind of even flex a little bit of like that emotional intelligence and build some of that to understand like what are maybe some of the challenges that the project has faced in the past. I think that was a really big one. If I'm thinking of a specific example in my project, is just knowing that like the international university that helped lead our project funneled a lot of like early to mid something 20s project managers into this role. And I do think that there was a little bit of a burden on our local national staff who had worked with so many different mid 20 somethings first job people from the UK or from the US or elsewhere in Europe. And I think they'd had a lot of conversations over and over about things that they wanted to see done differently. And so realizing that, like, I'm not the first person who's had a new idea. There are challenges that have come up multiple times, and how can you take some time to understand kind of the setting that you're coming into, and then think about how you might be able to add some additional value or some change.
Yeah, that's great. Like the notion of humble listening, and recognizing, like, yes, I've gained this expertise, but expertise might look different depending on where you are, and being this whole notion of being open to other people's perspectives and respecting their lived experiences. So thank you both for that. And you both had reflected in your blogs that, you know, the relationships you built with many people in the local community were really so meaningful, and which just really speaks to the value of doing something like this. Nea, you had mentioned in one of your blogs that your days in the field were some of the most memorable because it gave you an opportunity to really connect and chat with the research assistants, and you learned a great deal, or gained a great deal of cultural awareness. And we're also able to share stories about your own Indian American upbringing and culture. And so I wanted to ask, what did you learn about the local community during these connections that you built, and their approach to healthcare?
I think in general, we learn a lot, especially in the past couple of years, about like the idea of like solidarity or allyship. And I know, like, Shivani, I think Partners in Health uses like the term accompaniment a lot, or something similar. And I think that one thing I really learned was, like, what does that look like in practice? It's one thing to kind of hear about it, but it's another to really feel supported by a group of people who, like, have really taken you in some ways. I felt very, very supported by the local staff members who I worked with. And it was special to build such strong connections, knowing that you had a very different upbringing, and to see how you can connect with people separate from some of like the more superficial things that you have day to day. Like, something I miss, for instance, is like, here in San Francisco, I'm often talking to people about something that's maybe like kind of pop culture related, or like a new happy hour, or this or that, things that are just very specific to the bubble that I'm in my life. And I think the sense of connecting with people where you don't really share that much of, you know, a common bubble of where you're from, but learning how to really connect with people across a lot of different identities, I think is important, and just something special in terms of my overall life experiences that I cherish. And I think your second question, right, was about approach to healthcare. I'm sure Shivani can speak to this one even more, but I think in comparing the way that the United States approaches healthcare, and specifically like public health infrastructure, there's a lot, I think, for us to learn from low and middle income countries who have had really great progress with, I guess, in an absolute way, fewer resources. So I think, you know, having a strong network of community health workers, of public health infrastructure, understanding the social determinants of health, I felt like there were a lot of things I was learning from local research assistants, again, that translated things I had learned in a public health textbook into how does this actually work in terms of having a strong community. And I'm sure we've seen a lot of those flaws come out in our response to the pandemic, but, you know, having really highly individualistic drivers to your behavior when public health is something that is community focused, and it relies on everybody feeling like they're working towards making sure that we have healthy communities. So I think there's definitely a juxtaposition in like how the US approaches healthcare and how a place like South Africa, or where I worked afterwards in Rwanda, approaches healthcare on a community level. So I felt like I was learning a lot there, as well as just through interpersonal connections like I talked about at the start.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, when I read both of your blogs or other of our fellows who do public health, there's so many approaches to healthcare in terms of the community sense that I'm like, oh, I wish wish we did that here in the US. So it's interesting how this is such a great learning opportunity for people who are doing this, who are invested and open. And Shivani, yeah, I would love to hear from your relationships with the local women, the women in the community that you forge bonds with. What did you learn about their approach to healthcare?
Yeah, so I think definitely the relationships I formed with the community health workers was the most meaningful aspect of my experience. I think it was just amazing to really observe and understand the ways that they had kind of taken on this role of being a leader within their communities. Someone who visits patients in their homes every week, advocates for individuals who may need additional social support, and really someone who promotes health in the community at large. Was incredible to see that, and also kind of intersecting it with some of the existing gender and social norms within the communities. The fact that a lot of these women, it was the first time in these communities that women were working outside of the home and kind of contributing to income for their households. And there was a significant amount of, I would say, empowerment associated with that, and being able to sit down with them and hear their stories about how they felt and how they had transformed in this role of being a leader within their communities was really inspiring to hear for me. So I think we just had a lot of amazing discussions, and as Neha mentioned, we all have differences as people in terms of backgrounds and where we come from, but at the end of the day, I think we also have a lot of similarities and common ground and things that we can relate on. And so forming those connections was extremely meaningful. And in terms of what I learned from them, I would say really just seeing the value in having someone accompany a patient through every step of their illness, from the time that, before they're even diagnosed, to when they're diagnosed, to managing their condition over time, to when they have a complication that makes them spiral out of control and kind of getting back into control. How the community health worker is with that patient through every step of their journey, I think is incredible. And as Neha, as you mentioned, there was a big emphasis on accompaniment, and specifically that word of kind of walking with someone in their journey. And so that was very incredible to see that. And then also, I think just on a broader structure, the way that community health workers really bridge the gaps between community level factors and sociocultural factors of patients in their homes, and bridging the gap between them and the larger healthcare system, and connecting them to the clinic, connecting them to tertiary care that they may need, that they may not know how to access if they didn't have someone who was accompanying them. So I think overall, it just helped me realize the tremendous value of having kind of an intermediary player in promoting health for patients and individuals within communities.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. Continuing on this learning in service, Nea, you wrote in one of your blogs about the Eastern Cape that in this challenging social, cultural, and economic environment, I learned about the ethical dilemmas of conducting international research. Will you please share some of the ethical dilemmas that surfaced during your time in South Africa?
Sure. So I think that as a concept, research is innately challenging in ethics, because you're typically in some way burdening a group that you're extracting some information from, with the idea that the positive impact that's going to happen won't be immediate. It's going to come later through maybe changes in government funding that's driven by the results that you find, or whatever it might be. And so I think that even just hearing Shivani talk about the ways in which the community health workers she supported were able to link the patients to better health resources is something that I think just shows like the direct NGO benefit versus an international research project, which in our case, we were collecting information from relatively under-resourced and somewhat at-risk adolescents who were oftentimes opening up about really challenging experiences and not having an opportunity to focus on giving those individuals a lot of individual support and referrals was, I think, challenging. And the project did do referrals. So if experiencing violence in the home, we would try to refer them to other support. But knowing that that wasn't our primary outcome was, I think, a challenge for me. And thinking through like how much trust an adolescent was building when they sat down for 2 to 3 hours with a research assistant and was really giving detailed information about, you know, their sexual and reproductive health practices, and then that they might not get extensive support afterwards, I think could really lead to some burnout and feeling of, well, I opened up about this and I didn't get that much support, or that support wasn't sustainable. I think it's really challenging. So definitely there was, through those projects and its findings, increases in certain government funding that was meant to support adolescents who were living with HIV or who were otherwise wanting better opportunities to utilize these sexual and reproductive health services. But that feeling of, did we really benefit that group that was originally burdened in the process, was a challenge. So both for the adolescent participants who we were really extracting that information from, and also from the research assistants and the local national staff who we were working with. I think that they were probably carrying some secondhand trauma throughout their time working on the project. And I think in an ideal world, we would have provided some additional support to them as well. I can't imagine that it would be easy to hear adolescents open up about some of these really troubling experiences, potentially having their own lived experiences with them as well. So I think research as a whole, in how it kind of has benefits down the line, but certain burdens up front, is a challenge. And then the way that we support the local national staff who allow the research to even happen at all is a challenge. So I think, especially in the Eastern Cape, which at least at the time, I believe, was one of the poorest, or if not the poorest province in South Africa, it's a great place to really understand what the vulnerability is and assess that. But it's also really easy then to have local employment opportunities that are not the best in terms of the benefits and the wages that are provided, knowing that employment is so high and that people will probably take the job anyway. So there were challenges there as well. And how can we better advocate for more benefits and more opportunities for the local research staff who allow all of this work to happen?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, it's interesting to hear that perspective, because you may not think about it initially when you're doing the research about the actual burden on the people who are the foundation of that research. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And Shivani, what, if any, ethical considerations surfaced during your project?
Yeah, so in the case of my project, I think the biggest ethical consideration was probably the yearly turnover of volunteers. And not only my position, but all of the volunteer roles in the organization. Pretty much every year there would be a new volunteer who would come in to fulfill that role. And so as you can imagine, that kind of creates a bit of a lag or some inefficiency, because kind of coming into a new role as an outsider, it takes a lot of time to actually understand the context, to really develop the relationships that you need to develop to be effective in your role, and to be able to adequately support the community health workers. All of that takes a lot of time. I think for me, it probably took about 3 or 4 months before I actually felt completely comfortable in my volunteer role. And went to the point where I felt like, okay, I understand the context well enough at this point, and I've developed the relationships well enough at this point for me to do my job effectively. But as you can imagine, that does create some challenges, because for the community health workers, from their perspective, they're individuals who have been in this role for several years. Some of them up to 10 years have been working as community health workers within their communities. And so they're pretty much already experts in what they do. And so it felt a little strange for me to come in as an outsider and be the individual who is responsible for kind of supervising people who already have so much more of an understanding of the context because they're from there and just of the day-to-day, aspects of the role. So I think that was the biggest ethical consideration, and the solution to that problem is investing in local capacity and really investing in training local individuals who have been community health workers to then be promoted to the supervisor role. And actually in 2019, the first community health worker supervisor was actually hired from the local community. And so that was a huge marker of progress, I think, within the organization. And since then, several others have been hired as well. And so I think that's the direction that we're moving in terms of investing in local capacity. But I just wanted to also mention that there are certain barriers that kind of prevent that from happening easily. So for example, just the financial, lack of financial resources that NGOs are often burdened with, or also considering some of the local social and cultural norms. So previously, it was difficult for the organization to actually hire local women to be in the supervisor role because it was difficult for women to leave their households and to go travel between multiple communities, because that's just not the typical norm in these communities. And so I think as the socio-demographic characteristics of a place change over time, you can kind of have more recruitment of local individuals, but there are factors that kind of support and challenge that transformation.
Well, great. Thank you for sharing. And that's amazing that you actually had to witness progress being made on this. But also, a really important point that even when there are things like this that surface or that happen, it's not always a malicious thing, or it's trial and error. And also NGOs usually have limited resources, but again, it looks like that organization is really making progress, and that's great that you were able to see that. So thank you both for sharing. Okay, I want to move on to, sorry about that. I want to move on to the last tenet of the learning service approach. And this is all about learning post-service. So when the volunteer gets home, the learning doesn't have to stop. This is a really important stage in that the volunteers are reflecting on their service, unpacking what they've learned, and thinking critically about how they can apply the knowledge that they gained moving forward. And thinking about this tenet, I wanted to ask both of you about how your experience has influenced what you're doing now. And Shivani, I know you're in medical school. So can you share how your experience in Chiapas has influenced how you approached your medical school studies?
Sure, yeah. So I'm 2 weeks away from finishing my first year of medical school. And so I was directly kind of able to apply everything I learned during my time in Chiapas coming into medical school. And I think it completely shaped everything about, how I view healthcare, the things that I'm interested in and have chosen to pursue within medical school. So I'll just start off with, I think it really gave me a deeper understanding of the social determinants of health. I think that's something that you can learn really in any context, but I think being able to observe the social determinants of health so in depth in one context really allow you to kind of make those cross-cultural connections and see, oh, this is the same barrier, but just manifesting in a different way. And so really just understanding, all of the different factors, community level factors that impact a patient's health that, may impede their ability to access care or manage their chronic condition, all of those things. And then I think also it gave me a really deep appreciation for an interdisciplinary approach to healthcare, because in Chiapas, I was really seeing how the community health worker was kind of in a triangle relationship with the patient and the healthcare provider or the healthcare system, and then also seeing how other individuals kind of influenced that. And I think in the US, it's very similar, where now I am not only considering, okay, it's just the provider and the patient, but also thinking about what's the role of the social worker, what's the role of, there's actually community health workers in the healthcare system here, nurses, physician assistants, nurse practitioners, how do all of these individuals collaborate to optimize the health of the patient? So that was really important to recognize. And I think in general, just having a health equity and social justice lens about healthcare in general, and viewing it as a fundamental human right rather than something that only certain privileged individuals are able to access, I think has really shaped kind of my approach as a future provider. And I think also it's really just shaped a lot of the things that I've chosen to do outside of medical school. So for example, I recently became a Schweitzer Fellow, and so I'm implementing a public health project focused on hypertension management at a local free clinic here in Dallas. And it's really focused on the same aspects that I observed in Chiapas about empowering patients to kind of play a more active role in their health and achieve better management of their chronic conditions. And so just being able to take everything I learned in Chiapas and directly apply it to the patient population here has been really valuable.
Thank you for sharing that. That's so wonderful that you're doing that in your own community, and it just kind of shows the full circle and how much value there is in volunteering abroad when you go in with a learning mindset. So thank you for sharing that, and congrats on being almost done with your first year of med school. And Naya, yeah, I would love to ask you too, as you had mentioned before, after your Christensen Fellowship, you went on to Rwanda to serve as a Global Health Corps Fellow, and you were working with the University of Global Health Equity. How do you feel your experience in the Eastern Cape helped you when you were in Rwanda?
Yeah, so I would say that broadly, my experiences throughout like the Christensen Fellowship and in other contexts in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is both the study abroad that I did in Botswana before I was working with Inter-Exchange and this research project, and then afterwards while I was in Rwanda. I think altogether, similar to what Shivani said, it helps you really connect the dots between some of the theory and the practice of engaging in equity-driven or social impact-driven work. So I think in particular, it helped me to recognize some of the broader patterns of both success and areas for improvement in global health and development work. And it helped me to understand how to leverage my voice and my experience to amplify the experiences of others where I'm working in the community, like having a community-driven programming and making sure that the perspectives of those who are most affected by a challenge are at the center of your programming in the decision-making and the future leadership. And so I think really, even what Shivani had said about, that community health worker supervisor role eventually going not to somebody who is volunteering maybe from the US, but to somebody from the local community, that was, I think, one of the biggest improvements that I saw made in the project that I worked on as well was like, how can we advocate for somebody who knows this project much better, has much more experience, being able to take over the project manager role and starting to reconsider, is the cycle that we currently have of how we develop and funnel in talent to these leadership positions, does that make sense? And can it be rethought in some ways as you think about the sustainability? And then broadly, I think that being able to think through how to take that equity lens has helped me in engaging with a lot of equity and inclusion work, both in the company I work at now and also on a nonprofit board that I work with for another organization that I've been volunteering with for quite some time. So I'll leave it there in case there are any other final questions, but it's definitely been, I think, similar to what Shivani had said in impacting both my day-to-day work now, but also other things that I choose to engage in and the approach I take.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I think, in Rwanda, I'm sure they were really happy, the local community were happy to have a volunteer like you that had experience and that you were interested in advocating for their voices. So thank you both. And we have just a couple minutes left, so I will ask anyone in the audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to chat them in. There were so many other questions that I wanted to ask Shivani and Nea, but in the essence of time, I didn't get to them all. So if we have any questions, please feel free to chat them in. And yeah, we'll hopefully get to them all. Don't have anything yet, but actually one question I had for you guys, if I know we only have a little bit of time, but how did you both vet the organization that you volunteered with for your Christensen fellowship? Like, how did you know, like, okay, yes, this is the organization that I feel good about being affiliated with? And I don't know, Shivani, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So for me, I think I was already familiar with the organization for several years before I applied for the position. So I had read several books about the organization's work, watched, the documentary about the work that they did, and really kind of done a lot of research about some of their outcomes and some of their programs, just from the internet, and also talking to other individuals who had worked with the organization directly. So I think a lot of different sources of information really allowed me to have kind of a good understanding of the work that the organization does and their approach. And I know that I knew that I really wanted to work with an organization that was centered around health equity, social justice, and really placed an emphasis on community integration and participatory methods. And so all of those things together led me to apply with Partners in Health.
Great. And Nea, how about you? How did you decide to volunteer with the organization, or I believe it maybe was a few different organizations or a university that in the Eastern Cape?
Yeah, well, one thing is in my GHC fellowship later, I also worked with a Partners in Health created organization. So I totally echo what Shivani said of like, some of those organizations are really like Partners in Health, I would say, is very reputable in that space as a nonprofit that has been doing that work for a long time. And then for the Christensen Fellowship, I think that knowing that I was working with a university that was well known for its research, so it was through the University of Oxford and their Department of Social Policy and Innovation, I think in and of itself felt like, oh, this will probably be a great research project. And I had read about the impact in terms of like the publications they had, driven changes to local policy. I think that it's a little bit more challenging to know like the individual project in terms of like the principal investigators, to what extent do they share the same values or believe in executing a project in a way that's very equity and justice driven. I think that that's a little bit harder to tell, but I also did quite a bit of research beforehand, but not, I guess, the same as Partners in Health, where there are books written by the founders and like, there's obviously more information about Partners in Health out there. But I think, yes, even with a much smaller scale project, you can certainly take a lot of efforts to help vet the organization and ensure that you're aligned. But sometimes you won't necessarily be, and it doesn't totally mean that you should turn down the opportunity, which is, I think, some of the information that I got about the project, even just in like the 2 weeks before I went, from another person who'd experienced working there. But at that time, it was a pretty small set of people who had worked on that project before me.
Great, thank you both for that. Yeah, so anybody else who's interested in volunteering abroad, you can kind of take their cue in terms of trying to find as much information as possible about the organization. Okay, and we're at about time. So I just want to thank everyone for joining, and a very, very special thank you to Nea and Shivani for taking time out of your day to share your experience. We really appreciate it. And here's my contact information. So if anybody has questions about the Christensen Fellowship or the programs that InterExchange offers for U.S. citizens, please feel free to email or call me. I'm happy to share more information. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.